his name was James. On paper, he had everything: a brilliant strategist, respected CEO, the kind of leader who never hesitated, never stammered, never blinked. People trusted him because he always had the answers. And he always had the answers because he believed he had to. He built companies like machines. He managed crises like chessboards. He was the one they called when things were falling apart because he never did. But he was dying inside. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of slow collapse that doesn't break windows, just light. He stopped sleeping, he stopped listening, he kept performing. Until one day in a meeting he should have dominated, his CFO asked a question so routine it should have rolled off his tongue and James couldn't speak. He opened his mouth but no sound came. He stared at the table. His mind, usually 12 moves ahead, was silent. Blank, not frozen, empty. No one in the room judged him. But in that moment he felt naked. Not because he didn't know, but because he'd built his entire worth on never letting that happen. That was the fracture, not in the business, in the mask. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist who believed the soul speaks not in logic but in symbols, wrote, "We must give up our stranglehold on the familiar and at least listen to what the unconscious may have to say to us." That moment for James was the unconscious speaking. And for the first time in his career, he listened. Not to fix, not to solve, to feel. This isn't a story about collapse. This is a story about rebirth. Because what if the pressure you carry to know, to prove, to perform, is the very thing keeping you from becoming who you were always meant to be? What if knowing isn't mastery, but limitation? Jung believed the self, the deep center of who we are, is not something we figure out. It's something we surrender to. The more you try to define it, the more it slips through your grasp. And the more you pretend to know, the more disconnected you become from what actually matters. You've likely felt this. That strange hollow echo even at the top of your game. That quiet voice beneath all your planning asking, is this really it? That's not weakness, that's the call. It's the same one that came for James. The same one that comes for every leader who's brave enough to stop performing certainty and start listening to the unknown. Because knowing might make you efficient, but it won't make you whole. And it won't make you wise. The real journey doesn't start with what you know. It starts with what you're finally willing to admit you don't. James had built his entire identity on being the one who could predict the future. Risk analysis, contingency plans, bulletproof logic. Certainty wasn't a preference, it was a survival mechanism. He wore it like armor. But over time, that armor didn't protect him. It cut off his circulation. And then it became a cage. Certainty is addictive. And like all addictions, it has a cost. Carl Jung warned that when the ego fuses with intellect and control, it begins to silence the deeper intelligence within, the intuitive, the emotional, the symbolic. But he wasn't alone in this. Lao Tzu said, "To know that you do not know is the best. Not to know that you do not know is a disease." And Alan Watts once observed, the desire for security and the feeling of insecurity are the same thing. The more James doubled down on control, the more he found himself managing outcomes instead of meaning. Every conversation became a calculation, every silence a threat, every unknown an insult to his authority. And without even realizing it, he stopped listening. He was full of answers, but hollow of presence. And that's the moment leadership breaks down. Not when the data fails, but when the person disappears. What no one talks about is the spiritual cost of high-functioning leadership. Not just burnout, but soul starvation. The hunger not for more success, but for space. For mystery, for breath. James didn't realize how far he drifted until one day in a casual conversation someone said, "Honestly? I don't know." He laughed politely, but inside something shattered. He envied them because they were free to explore, free to admit uncertainty, free to ask real questions without having to look infallible. And this is what we rarely say out loud: certainty is brittle, presence is durable. Hustle culture will never tell you this. Productivity blogs won't mention it. But every leader who has stayed up past midnight staring into the ceiling knows it's true. The more you perform omniscience, the more disconnected you become from life itself. And slowly, strategy replaces spontaneity, mastery replaces meaning, clarity replaces curiosity. Until you realize you know everything but feel nothing. There's a Taoist fable, one James eventually discovered, about a farmer whose horse runs away. The neighbors cry, "What bad luck?" He says, "Maybe." The horse returns with wild stallions. "What good luck?" "Maybe." His son breaks a leg riding one. "Terrible luck, maybe." When soldiers come to conscript able-bodied sons, the injured boy is spared. "Wonderful luck, maybe." The farmer never flinches. He refuses the illusion of knowing what's good or bad. He simply watches, listens, lives. Not because he lacks intelligence, but because he understands its limits. That's the kind of leadership James was beginning to remember. Not the kind that commands from a script, but the kind that learns from the moment. He started showing up differently. He asked more questions. He paused more often. He admitted, "I don't know," and watched his team lean in closer, not away. Because real leadership doesn't come from certainty, it comes from presence. And presence doesn't come from knowing. It comes from not needing to. For weeks, James had been feeling it. That low-grade numbness behind his eyes. That invisible fog between the world and his thoughts. That strange pulsing ache beneath all the knowing. He tried to outrun it. Early meetings, tight deadlines, late-night dashboards. More control, more logic. More pretending that knowing the next step was the same as knowing himself. Until the night it finally broke. It was 2:17 a.m. The city outside was quiet. The fluorescent hum of his office ceiling whispered a rhythm he'd stopped noticing long ago. He sat at his desk, staring at a glowing spreadsheet. The cells flickered with projections, forecasts, ratios, but his eyes couldn't hold them. His hands felt cold. His jaw was clenched so tightly he didn't realize it was shaking. He moved to type, paused, lowered his hands, and whispered, not to anyone, just to the silence, "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." It wasn't a breakdown. There were no tears, no cinematic drama, just stillness, and a strange kind of relief that terrified him. Carl Jung called this the nigredo, the blackening, the symbolic death of the false self, the part of you that thinks it's in charge. The moment when every tool you've ever used turns back into dust. This was the man who once signed multi-million-dollar deals between flights, who advised governments, mentored founders, predicted market crashes with surgical clarity. Now he couldn't finish a sentence. And somewhere inside that silence he saw it, the lie of omniscience. He'd built a life on the illusion that mastery meant never hesitating, never doubting, never being wrong. But now the price was clear. He had become a stranger to his own soul. And this is where most people flinch. They reach for the fix, the next book, the reinvention strategy, a sabbatical with structure. But this wasn't burnout, it was dismemberment. The old identity was falling apart. And the question wasn't how to rebuild it. It was whether he'd be brave enough to let it dissolve. Because here, at the threshold of unknowing, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, but space. And in that space came something strange. A dream he couldn't explain. He was standing in a vast, dark field. Above him, a single star pulsed. It didn't speak, it just pulsed like a heartbeat. And he woke up crying. Not because he understood it, but because for the first time he didn't need to. The next morning, James didn't call a coach. He didn't launch a self-reinvention plan. He made coffee, sat at the window, watched the light move across the room. And something inside him stayed still, not frozen, present. He went to work, met with his team, faced a decision that would normally trigger hours of analysis, whiteboards, projections, hedged plans. Instead, he paused, looked around, and said, "What do you think we should do?" The room went silent. People stared, not out of confusion, out of shock, because James had always known. He had always been the one to speak first, fill the space, lead from certainty. But today he waited, and something shifted. The youngest team member, quiet, usually hesitant, offered a perspective no one expected. It changed the course of the project. And it never would have happened if James had played the knower again. This wasn't abdication, it was integration. Carl Jung taught that real transformation doesn't come through willpower, but through surrender, through listening, through aligning with the self, the mysterious center of being that doesn't scream to be heard. It waits, it dreams. It pulses like a distant star in a dream. And when you stop trying to control it, you begin to move with it. James started seeing these moments everywhere, not dramatic epiphanies, but patterns, synchronicities. He'd think of someone and they'd call. He'd cancel a meeting only to discover that staying quiet led to the very insight he would have missed. He wasn't in control, but he was no longer afraid of not being. This was the gift of not knowing. Not just the freedom to be uncertain, but the power to be available to truth, to others, to intuition and to mystery. David White once wrote, "Anything or anyone that does not bring you alive is too small for you." Knowing had become too small for James. Control had become a coffin. And now his life felt porous again, open, wild, and most of all alive. He remembered the words of the Hopi elders. "There is a river flowing very fast now. Those who cling to the shore will suffer. Push off into the middle of the river. Keep your head above water. See who is there with you. Do not look outside yourself for the leader." This could be a good time. James had let go of the shore. He wasn't steering, he wasn't bracing, he was breathing. And for the first time in years, he felt like a leader again. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had become someone who no longer needed them. And people could feel it. They didn't just follow him now, they trusted him. Because his presence no longer said, "I know," it said, "I'm here, I'm listening, let's find out together," and that changed everything. James hadn't disappeared. He didn't retreat into the woods, grow a beard, and renounce ambition. He was still showing up to meetings, still making decisions, still leading. But everything about the way he led had changed. Before he spoke to persuade. Now he spoke to connect. Before he filled the room with answers. Now he let the room breathe. What shifted wasn't his role, it was his presence. People began to notice. His voice was quieter, but it carried more weight. His eyes held you longer. His pauses weren't laced with tension, they were invitations. Jung taught that the archetype of the sage is not about retreat from the world, it's about returning to it with new eyes. And that's what James had done. He returned to his life, not as the king who controlled the domain, but as the sage who listened to its currents. He still had vision, still had strength. But now his strength came from something deeper than certainty, it came from presence. There's a subtle shift that happens when someone is no longer afraid of the unknown. They stop defending their position. They stop needing to prove they're right. They start noticing things that others miss, body language, silence, what's not being said. And because they're no longer afraid to be changed, they become the ones who change others. That's what was happening around James. People stopped coming to him just for direction. They started coming to be heard, to feel safe in not knowing, to risk saying what they really thought. And his team got better. Not because he made better plans, but because he created a space where wisdom could surface from anywhere. This is what it means to lead from listening. Not passive silence, but active presence. A depth of stillness that doesn't collapse under pressure, it absorbs it, transforms it. Jung once said, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." James was no longer dreaming. He was awake to himself, to others, to the mystery unfolding in every moment. He had become someone who no longer needed to lead by being the one who knew the most. He led by being the one who could hold the most mystery without flinching. And that kind of presence changes everything. James didn't become a mystic. He didn't start quoting poetry in the middle of strategy sessions. He just stopped pretending that he had to see the entire path to take the next step. And that changed the energy in every room he walked into. People began to trust not just his ideas, but his being. Because something about him no longer demanded certainty. It welcomed reality. And in a world addicted to projection, that felt like a revolution. This is what Jung meant when he described individuation, not perfection, but integration. James had walked through the collapse of control. He had surrendered to not knowing. And on the other side, he didn't find the old kind of power. He found presence. A power that didn't depend on performance. A wisdom that didn't depend on explanation. Because, here's the paradox, when you no longer need the world to affirm who you are, you become someone worth following. Not because you're above anyone, but because you're with them. You can walk beside complexity, hold space for contradiction. Say, I don't know, with strength instead of shame, and that is mastery. Not dominance, not performance, not control, but the courage to walk with mystery and still stay grounded in yourself. Jung once said, we are not what happens to us, we are who we choose to become. James had become someone different. Not someone new, but someone remembered. And he knew now the gift of not knowing isn't the absence of answers. It's the presence of wonder, the reopening of the heart, the softening of the soul's edges until life can be felt again. And this is what leadership needs now. Not more speed, not more strategy, not more certainty, but more leaders who are no longer afraid to say, I'm here, I'm listening, let's walk together. So if you've ever felt the weight of needing to know, if you've ever stared into a room and realized your brilliance couldn't save you from yourself, then maybe like James, you're not breaking, you're being called. Not to give it all up, but to finally return, not with more answers, but with the only thing that ever truly changes the world, a presence shaped by mystery. And if that speaks to something inside you, then leave a comment below. Say, I'm learning to listen. Because someone else might be holding on too tightly. And they need to know that it's okay to let go. That it's not the end, it's the beginning. And it starts right here, right now. In the gift of not knowing.